Just as the final words faded into the warm afternoon air, a loyal dog leapt forward with a cry no one could explain. The crowd stiffened, the sky seemed to still, and uneasy glances flickered from face to face. She refused to move, her gaze locked on the closed coffin as if guarding a secret no living soul yet understood. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, but no one could guess how deep the mistake ran, or how a single moment would unravel everything they believed about loyalty, destiny, and the mysteries that refused to stay buried. But before we begin, write in the comments where you're from. I'm curious to see how far these stories can travel. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new captivating tales. Let's begin. Detective Andrew Collins was the kind of man Riverview folks told stories about, harder than a coffin nail, sharper than a winter wind off the lake, but with a quiet kindness that lived in the way he treated strays, widows, and lost souls alike. Folks said if trouble ever found you in the dark alleys behind Main Street, Andy Collins would find you faster, fight harder, and stay longer than any man alive or dead. So when they said Andy had been killed in a hit-and-run outside St. Mary's Medical Center, crushed under the wheels of some runaway truck on a slick November night, the whole town folded into itself with the kind of sadness that saps the color from autumn leaves. There were casseroles piled 6 feet deep in the Collins kitchen, church bells tolled like they were hammering nails into heaven's own door, and the Riverview Police Department draped black sashes over their badges in a silence so heavy it bent their backs. But nobody mourned harder than Roxy, the old German shepherd who'd ridden shotgun beside Andy for 12 years, through every rainstorm, gunfight, and broken heart Riverview had to offer. As the funeral dragged on under a low, angry sky, Roxy's behavior grew wilder, sharper, almost painful to watch, like the animal knew something no human brain could wrap itself around. She scratched the dirt with bleeding paws, she whined until the air itself seemed to thin out, and every few minutes she let loose another broken, trembling howl that twisted the hearts of every man and woman standing stiff around that grave. Finally, it was Andy's younger brother, Paul Collins, a man who wore grief on his face like battle scars, who threw down his hat and marched over to the casket, his voice breaking as he ordered the funeral director to open the damn thing, now, before that dog tears it apart. The director, a pale slip of a man used to calm, quiet sorrow, stammered and shook, but the weight of the crowd's expectant, fearful silence ground him down, and with trembling hands he set to work on the brass latches. The lid creaked, slow and heavy, like a scream trapped inside an old house, and when it finally swung open, what lay inside wasn't Detective Andrew Collins at all, but the bloated, unfamiliar face of a stranger nobody could name. There was a moment so silent you could hear the dry grass whispering against tombstones, the stunned breath of 100 souls drawn tight in their throats. Then came the shouts, the cries, the gasps of old women and hard men alike, as horror spread like wildfire through the crowd, leaving raw fear and confusion in its place. Aunt May, who had known Andy since he was a freckle-faced boy chasing fireflies by the river, collapsed into her husband's arms, wailing in a voice that cracked like dry wood under a heavy boot. The chief of police turned white as milk, snatched his radio from his belt, and began barking frantic orders nobody could really understand, his words a garbled mess of fear and duty. And standing at the center of it all was Roxy, silent now, her head cocked to the side, staring down into that coffin with the calm, knowing sadness of a creature who had seen death, and knew when it wasn't true. The hospital was called St. Mary's Medical Center, where the living and the dead were meant to be sorted like packages at a post office, but that night had been a storm of confusion, power outages, and staff stretched thinner than a sheet of ice in April. Mistakes had been made, the staff confessed in voices tight with terror, records had been blurred, tags misplaced, bodies swapped like bad cards in a gambler's losing hand. Somewhere in that vast, humming maze of blinking machines and antiseptic halls, Andrew Collins still lay, not dead, not gone, but clinging to life by the thinnest thread, hidden away in a coma nobody had bothered to check twice. The whole town seemed to tilt sideways under the weight of that revelation, and it was Roxy, faithful, stubborn, heartbreakingly loyal Roxy, who had dragged the truth out of the grave with her own teeth and broken heart. But even as hope flared like a match in the cold darkness, there was a shadow growing behind it, a secret darker and crueler than anyone standing in that graveyard could have guessed. The sirens tore through Riverview like screaming ghosts, shattering windows of quiet grief as patrol cars and ambulances sped toward St. Mary's Medical Center, lights blazing against the bruised afternoon sky. Inside those speeding vehicles, hearts pounded like war drums, fists clenched white around radios barking out half-formed orders, while every man and woman knew they were chasing something far crueler than just death. It was time itself slipping through their fingers. Roxy rode in the front seat of the lead squad car, her body pressed tight against the window, her old eyes locked forward with a fire no human could fake, no machine could replicate. When they burst through the sliding glass doors of the emergency ward, doctors and nurses scattered like startled crows, faces blanching white at the sight of police pouring in like a flood they could never hope to stop. It was Chief Harold Briggs, old as stone and twice as stubborn, who shoved a trembling nurse against the wall and growled through gritted teeth, "Where the hell is Andrew Collins, and don't you lie to me, girl, not unless you want blood on your hands tonight." They found him 3 floors up, in room 317, tucked between a laundry closet and a supply room nobody had entered in 2 days, lying there like a forgotten saint with tubes and wires sprouting from his arms. The sight of Andy, alive but battered, breathing only by the grace of machines and stubborn will, ripped sobs from men who hadn't cried since Vietnam, and brought the whole damn police force to its knees right there in the hallway. Paul Collins broke first, stumbling to his brother's bedside with shaking hands, whispering, "Hang on, Andy, you stubborn old mule, hang on, don't you dare leave me now, not after this." Doctors scrambled around them, throwing out words like stabilize, and intubate, and critical condition, but all the words in the world couldn't cover the truth burning in every heart. Andrew Collins had been buried alive by human mistake, and it was only a dog's loyalty that had brought him back. Somewhere down the hall, the hospital administrator, a narrow-shouldered man with panic shining out of his watery eyes, tried to explain away the horror with charts, signatures, and tired excuses, but nobody listened, not anymore. The more they dug into the records, the stranger things became, because the body that had been laid in Andy's coffin didn't match any missing persons reports, any hospital intake forms, or even any police files across 3 neighboring counties. The dead man was a mystery, a blank slate in a world built on paper trails, and that silence around his name was colder and more frightening than the grave they had nearly thrown Andrew into. When the county coroner finally showed up, an old friend of Andy's from way back in Little League days, he pulled Paul aside with a face so grim it could have soured milk and whispered words that made Paul's stomach turn to stone. The dead man hadn't just died from natural causes, or from some quiet mercy, he'd been murdered, throat crushed by blunt force, hidden away in St. Mary's as if someone had been desperate to bury him quickly, without questions, without noise. And standing in the hall outside room 317, where Andrew Collins fought for life he didn't yet know he still had, the leaders of Riverview realized they weren't just dealing with a hospital's mistake, they were standing at the edge of a conspiracy that reached deeper than they had ever imagined. As night fell over Riverview, washing the town in shadows and thin silver moonlight, fear began to creep into the bones of the people who had always believed that bad things happened somewhere else, not here, not home. Neighbors locked their doors for the first time in years, leaving porch lights burning like desperate lighthouses against the dark unknown swirling just outside the windows. In the cold silence of Andrew's hospital room, Roxy never moved from her post, her head resting on the edge of the bed, her body trembling every time the machines gave off a new, awful beep. Paul kept vigil too, pacing the floor with a desperation that grew heavier every hour, trying to piece together the scattered, bloody puzzle that fate had thrown at their feet. And somewhere in the deep corners of that hospital, far from the glow of duty and love, a shadow watched them, someone who smiled without kindness and planned to finish what had been so carelessly interrupted. The newspapers the next morning screamed headlines in bold, angry letters that bled across every front page, words that even the old-timers shook their heads over at the diner downtown. Detective buried alive. Hospital horror, body switch at St. Mary's. Hero dog uncovers deadly secret. The TV crews rolled in with their blinking cameras and empty promises, and for a while Riverview became a place people whispered about in the cities, a cautionary tale wrapped in tragedy and impossible survival. But inside the hospital, while Andrew lay silent and Roxy kept watch, the true storm was still gathering, silent and unseen, ready to break loose with a force that would tear apart the lives of everyone left standing. By the third day, Andrew Collins stirred, a faint flicker of life beneath the bruised surface of his battered body, and every man and woman who saw it swore they felt the whole world hold its breath just to listen. Paul was the first to notice, a quiet tightening of Andy's fingers against the bedsheets, a twitch of muscle that was no accident, no random firing of a dying mind, but the stubborn first sign of a man refusing to lay down. Doctors rushed in with their clipboards and worried eyes, but Paul shoved them aside with a force born not of anger, but of hope, a rough, raw hope so bright it hurt to look at. Roxy barked once, sharp and clear, a battle cry more than a sound, and for the first time since this nightmare began, the people of Riverview dared to believe they might just steal a soul back from the grave. But even as the old warrior stirred beneath hospital sheets, darkness was thickening around them, weaving through the halls of St. Mary's with a purpose colder than steel and sharper than broken glass. Back at the station, Detective Mark Hastings had taken it upon himself to lead the investigation into the body switch, wearing his sorrow like a badge heavier than any issued by the state. Mark was Andy's best friend, or so he said, his fishing buddy on slow Sundays, his drinking partner when the nights got too long, the man who had stood up at Andy's wedding and sworn he'd be there to watch his six until the end. Nobody questioned it when Mark took the lead, nobody second-guessed when he barked out orders or pored over files until his hands shook and his eyes burned red. And maybe that's why nobody noticed how his questions danced just a little too wide around the hospital records, how his reports came back just a little too clean, too empty, too perfectly wrapped to be real. It was Roxy again, faithful, unblinking, unbending, who first caught the scent, her body stiffening when Mark entered the hospital room, her low growl curling up from her chest like smoke from an old fire. Paul, weary and drowning in grief, didn't catch it at first, the subtle way Mark always asked about Andrew's condition but never stayed to pray, never leaned close enough to see the bruises and cuts that spoke of a fight far dirtier than a simple accident. He didn't notice how Mark lingered in the hallway whenever the doctor spoke of legal guardianship, financial affairs, insurance claims, words wrapped in politeness but dripping with greed if you listened close enough. It wasn't until the third night, when Paul caught Mark alone in the hospital records room, rifling through Andrew's personal files with hands that shook from more than just exhaustion, that the first cold thread of suspicion wove its way into his heart. Mark jumped when Paul called his name, his face pulling tight into a mask of strained smiles, excuses falling from his mouth like leaves from a dying tree, brittle and false. And for the first time, Paul looked into the eyes of the man he had called brother, and saw something there he couldn't name, but knew he could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, buried deep within the corners of St. Mary's administrative offices, an old nurse named Evelyn Booker, who had worked there longer than most of the young doctors had been alive, found herself haunted by a memory that wouldn't leave her alone. 2 nights before Andrew was declared dead, she remembered seeing a figure in scrubs, face hidden behind a surgical mask, tampering with patient charts and slipping quietly into the very ward where Andrew had been placed. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, mistakes happened in busy hospitals, and fear made fools of sharp minds, but now that the whole town was ablaze with scandal, her conscience clawed at her with teeth sharper than guilt itself. Gathering her courage like an old soldier preparing for one last fight, Evelyn scribbled down everything she remembered, the height, the build, the strange patch on the man's sleeve, and placed it all in a sealed envelope addressed to the police department. But Evelyn Booker didn't live to see the letter delivered, for that night, as rain lashed the windows of her tiny apartment, someone came calling, a shadow without a name, without a face, carrying silence and death in equal measure. The next morning, when Evelyn's body was found slumped in her favorite armchair, the official cause was ruled a heart attack without much question or fuss. But Roxy, brought along on a hunch by Paul, whose instincts were sharpening like a blade on a whetstone, sniffed the air inside that room and whined low in her throat, backing away from the body as if it carried a poison she could not explain. And in that moment, Paul knew with a certainty deeper than blood and older than fear that Evelyn Booker had not died by accident, and that the enemy they faced was willing to kill again to keep his secrets buried. Somewhere behind the walls of Riverview's smiling faces and polished badges, a killer moved freely, cloaked in trust and history, wearing a mask none had yet dared to tear away. And if they didn't move fast, faster than fear, faster than grief. The next body to be buried might just be Andrew Collins himself, this time for good. It happened just after midnight, when the halls of St. Mary's whispered with the lonely sounds of machines and the distant echoes of tired footsteps dragging through polished linoleum. Andrew Collins, against every odds stacked against a man crushed beneath the weight of betrayal and steel, opened his eyes and looked straight into the darkness like he had been awake the whole time, just waiting for the right moment. Paul, half asleep in a stiff chair by the window, jerked awake as Roxy gave a sharp bark, her tail thudding against the floor with frantic, desperate hope that made Paul's throat tighten. Andrew's voice, rough as gravel and barely more than a breath, formed two words that shattered the world they thought they understood: "It's Mark." And just like that, every question, every suspicion, every thread they had pulled at in confusion twisted together into a single rope thick enough to hang a man. Paul stumbled to his brother's side, tears burning his eyes, whispering that he was safe, that everything was all right, even as a cold hand gripped his heart and told him it was all a lie. Andrew, blinking slowly against the bright, sterile light above, fought to speak, his words coming in fits and starts, painting a story so dark it blackened the air between them. Mark Hastings had been there the night of the accident, only it hadn't been an accident at all, it had been a planned, brutal attempt to silence Andrew forever before he could expose something rotten at the core of Riverview's police department. For months, Andrew had been piecing together threads no one else wanted to see: missing funds, falsified reports, names of good men and women being used like pawns in a game that stank of greed and fear. And Mark, best friend, fishing buddy, best man at the wedding, had been smiling all along, carrying a knife just waiting for the moment to bury it between Andrew's ribs. The paradox, the cruel, gut-twisting paradox, was this: if Mark had succeeded that night, if Andrew had truly died under that truck's wheels, Riverview would have mourned him as a hero and Mark would have stood front and center at the funeral, weeping crocodile tears. But by failing, by botching the plan and leaving Andrew breathing in a forgotten hospital room, Mark had created the very conditions that allowed the truth to crawl back into the light on the back of a faithful dog's loyalty. If Roxy had not howled against that coffin, if she had not refused to let grief make her blind, the greatest betrayal Riverview had ever known would have been buried so deep no hand could ever have clawed it free. Paul sat back hard in his chair, the world tilting dangerously around him, his mind racing not just with anger, but with shame, shame for having trusted a man whose heart had rotted away behind a badge. Outside, the storm broke loose over Riverview, thunder splitting the sky into jagged pieces, rain hammering against windows like the fists of 1,000 angry souls demanding justice. Meanwhile, down in the basement archives of the Riverview Police Department, a small, forgotten file lay hidden beneath a stack of unmarked folders, its pages stained with the fingerprints of men who thought themselves untouchable. It was Roxy again who found the scent, dragging Paul through the old records room while officers blinked in confusion, her nose twitching with the certainty of an old warhorse sniffing out hidden mines. Inside that battered folder were copies of transfer orders, bank ledgers with numbers that didn't add up, and signed statements that tied Mark Hastings not just to local corruption, but to something far uglier, something that reached out of Riverview like a cancer spreading into neighboring towns. There were names on those papers that made Paul's skin crawl: respected officials, long-trusted judges, even priests who had blessed the town's children and whispered prayers at Andrew's would-be funeral. And standing at the rotten center of it all was Mark, smiling like a man who had convinced himself that no amount of dirt could ever stain his hands if he just kept them moving fast enough. Paul gathered the evidence with hands that shook not from fear, but from a righteous fury born of betrayal so deep it scraped the soul raw. He called in the few men and women he knew were clean, old-timers like Sheriff Wallace McCoy and Deputy Helen James, folks too stubborn to be bought and too mean to be tricked. Together, they hatched a plan, a trap not just for Mark, but for every coward and liar who had built their thrones on the broken backs of honest men. Paul knew they had only one shot, and it had to be perfect, because if Mark even suspected he had been found out, he would vanish into the night like smoke through broken fingers. The stage was set, the bait prepared, and somewhere deep in the endless thunder of that storm-racked night, the final showdown between truth and betrayal began to take shape, sharp and inevitable as the blade of a guillotine poised to fall. The plan was set in motion with the kind of grim precision born only in men who have nothing left to lose, a desperate chess game played in silence against an enemy who believed himself already victorious. Paul stood inside St. Mary's Chapel, neutral ground, sacred and old, where the high rafters caught every word like a whisper carried straight to heaven's own gates. He clutched the battered file folder in his calloused hands, a lifetime's worth of betrayal crammed between thin paper and cheap staples, as he waited for the traitor to walk into the trap with the swagger of a man who still thought he was untouchable. Outside, the rain came down in endless silver sheets, drenching the streets of Riverview, washing the dirt and blood into the gutters, as if the town itself was trying to scrub its sins clean before dawn. And when Mark Hastings finally entered the chapel, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the solemn light, Paul felt a sadness so sharp it nearly doubled him over, because once upon a time he would have trusted that man with his own grave. Mark smiled that easy, well-practiced smile, the one that had fooled a town for 15 long years, and asked after Andrew's condition with a smoothness that should have curdled the blood of any man with half a working heart. Paul, keeping his voice steady through the storm roaring in his chest, handed over the file with a nod, watching Mark's face as the man opened it, page by damning page, and the color drained from his skin like whiskey spilled onto dry earth. Behind the altar, hidden in the shadows like revenants from another age, Sheriff Wallace McCoy and Deputy Helen James waited with their service weapons drawn and their eyes locked on the man they had once saluted without question. Mark tried to laugh it off first, the same way a guilty man jokes before the noose tightens, but when Paul uttered the words, "You're under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, and treason against the people of Riverview," that false laughter crumbled into something much uglier. For a moment, it looked like Mark would fight, his hand twitching toward the pistol at his belt, but one look at Paul's face, carved out of stone and heartbreak, and he knew the battle was already lost. But Riverview wasn't done bleeding yet, because even as Mark was handcuffed and dragged out into the driving rain, shouting curses and threats no one bothered to answer, another truth fell into Paul's hands like a hammer shattering old bones. In the files Mark had been so desperate to bury was a sealed letter, one written by Andrew himself, months before the accident, addressed not to the department, not to the mayor, but to Paul. Inside that envelope, penned in the shaky, tired handwriting of a man carrying a burden too heavy for one soul, Andrew confessed that he had suspected Paul himself might be compromised, that blood ties could no longer be trusted when money and power twisted men into things unrecognizable. The letter wasn't an accusation, not a weapon, but a desperate prayer from one brother to another, a plea for Paul to look deep into himself and choose the hard, lonely road of honesty, even if it meant walking away from everything he loved. Paul sat there in the empty chapel long after the others had gone, reading that letter over and over, his heart breaking anew with every line, because he realized he had come so close, so heartbreakingly close, to becoming exactly the kind of man Andrew had feared. Days later, when Andrew was strong enough to sit up, they brought him the news in slow, careful words, each revelation hitting harder than the last, until the old detective stared out the window with tears sliding silently down the lines of his weathered face. Roxy, ever faithful, ever constant, laid her head in his lap, grounding him in a way no words ever could, her soft whine the only sound in the room thick with things too heavy to say aloud. Andrew simply nodded, once, a slow, deliberate motion, as if to say he had known all along that the world would break his heart, and he had chosen to love it anyway. The town of Riverview tried to heal, patching over the deep wounds with prayer breakfasts, charity drives, and loud declarations about moving forward, but the wiser souls knew that some scars run deeper than the flesh. And on the edge of town, beneath a stubborn oak tree battered by countless storms, a simple brass plaque was placed, not for a mayor or a sheriff or a man, but for Roxy, the dog who refused to believe what the world told her, and saved a soul by trusting her own broken heart. Write in the comments where you're from, let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon.